Historical dive into swords today is perhaps one of the most recent ones we've seen so far on the channel. What we're looking at here is a sword that develops and evolves and has a life cycle that fits fully within the 20th century. If you saw the previous video where I cleaned it, you'll know that this is a Portuguese Cavalry Sabre. Now, I don't remember if in that video I mentioned that it may be a 1905 model, but it's not. It's a 1915 model Cavalry Sabre for the Portuguese army. Not much information is available to the general researcher, let's say, as I am in this case. I'm sure there's a bunch of specialized material and literature in Portuguese. I don't have it, I don't have access to it, and most importantly, I don't speak Portuguese, so I'm not sure how that could help me. So a general kind of research that you can do just online shows not much information on this sword. And actually, not many of these are even available. It's actually pretty hard even to find pictures of it. It's not impossible once you know the model, but I'd say there are limited resources for research. And I think this is due to the specific moment in history when this sword came out, and also the peculiar or unique aspects of Portuguese history specifically in the time frame, let's say, between World War I and, well, the rest of the 20th century. So this kind of concurs to make this sword a bit of a late arrival, let's say, to actual combat swords. And this, I think, explains why we don't have that much information about them, or why there's relatively little interest in them, perhaps. And honestly, that's a shame, because it's a rather beautiful sword. We'll see the details close up. Now I want to focus on the context, but it's a really cool sword. As the name suggests, it's a model that is released or comes to be in 1915. So this is a rather eventful year. Most of the European powers are already heavily involved in World War I. So there's the whole French front, let's say, is the one of the big centers of conflict, together with the Eastern Front, of course. And 1915 is also the year in which Italy joins the war. So we have the opening of another front between Italy and the Habsburg Empire. So quite complex, seeing a big involvement of different kinds of troops, different warfare. And as we probably know, World War I is a bit of a defining moment in terms of warfare evolution, because we switch from an old school mentality into basically what is modern warfare. So Portugal, however, is not yet involved in the war. So they released this sword, this is the cavalry sword, but their involvement is only going to start in 1916. And even then, in a limited capacity. So we know that Portuguese troops were involved on the French battlefields. I don't really know how much cavalry was involved in that part of fighting. So it's hard to determine how much use this sword actually saw. Also, keep in mind that World War I, as this defining moment between warfare of the past and modern warfare, also determines the end of cavalry as a form of combat. It gets substituted by tanks. So while cavalry was used heavily too, in the initial parts of the war and in specific areas of the conflict, World War I is basically where cavalry becomes obsolete. So this sword comes to be right at the boundary, let's say, of it becoming obsolete. Perhaps another interesting point to consider when we think about why this sword wasn't more broadly distributed, or isn't more present in the collector's market, or just in the minds of people who enjoy swords and research them. It may be because of the relative isolation of Portugal after World War I-ish. So it's a time of political instability, as probably we all know is going on in most of Europe. And in 1927, we have a coup, and that dictatorship kind of consolidates in 1933 under the ruling of Salazar. And this regime will then last until the mid-70s. And this regime, without going into a whole bunch of details, but had a neutral stance when it came to conflicts like World War II that were boiling in the rest of Europe. So it kind of kept Portugal a little out of all the mess that was happening over in Europe. It did build up a bunch of mess within Portugal, but this is a different topic. So you may think, okay, this is just one of the many late 19th century, early 20th century swords built kind of with those fragile blades that French swords had. And I have to say, that is not the case. This is a beefy blade. We'll check it out in detail, but this is not meant for parade. It's the sword that was designed, I think, for use. What's also interesting is maybe a little bit of a silver lining for this model specifically. Its history is not completely of being in the wrong place and in the wrong time, so to speak. It is still in use, as far as I can tell, as the saber of the presidential guard of the President of the Republic of Portugal. So you can still see some recent pictures. Not many I have found, and in most of them it's hard to tell because they are holding it, so it's not really easily visible. But yeah, they're using this sword in a nickel-plated version, so a little bit fancier, a little bit more blingy, but it is this sword. And I'm sure you're waiting to see it close up rather than hear me talk, so we'll do that right away. Okay, let's take a closer look at the 1915 Portuguese Cavalry Sabre. Now, I think the first noteworthy thing here about it is the size of the grip. So I don't have small hands by any means, but I could probably, yeah, this could be a two-hand saber for me. So it's really massive. And what's interesting is if you see pictures of today's presidential guards using them, they have these really big gloves as part of their uniform. So I'm assuming that, I'd have to check, of course, but in the way the Portuguese cavalry uniform must have been, they must have had these really hefty gloves so that to get an easy grip on their saber, the grip had to be really big. So that's quite interesting. And while we're here on the hilt area, let's take a look at the backstrap. So this is semi-reminiscent of some Italian swords, like I think it's the 1860, which just kind of come down in a cylinder, a rather flat cylinder. I kind of really like that shape. It has a little bit of a almost anatomical shape here where it kind of, there's a little ridge. And then we have this patterned section to hold the thumb in place, I suppose. And again, in terms of usage design, this reminds me a lot of the Italian sabers, which usually have a little cap here where you can fit the tip of your thumb. So it really invites, like the shape, the way it's designed invites this kind of grip. And I feel that this is very similar here, like this is really meant for your thumb to rest on. Moving on to the grip, we see it's a wooden grip with some like checkered work on it. It's very straightforward, I would say. It's also pretty cool. Again, looking at the ergonomical design here, it's really quite cool and modern, I think. You see this section here is meant to hold your index in place. So you really are invited exactly to hold the saber as it's meant to be held. There's really not a lot of room for mistakes here. It's very comfortable too. And one interesting thing, if we take a look at the pommel section, is that the peen area, I assume it's the peened blade, but it's covered by this metal cap, which I'm not sure how it's fixed in place. You can see there are some tool marks. Let's see if we can see them a little better. Yeah, you can probably see some tool marks all along the round cap here. So my guess is that it's a screw-on that you can kind of clamp and unscrew, and underneath it may be threaded blade or peened, I'm not sure. But actually that may be an idea for another video, so we'll see. Now, moving on to the actual hilt, I'll place it here like this for a moment so you can see it from above. It almost is reminiscent of a fencing saber to an extent. So you see there's no open work in it at all. It's a solid semi basket, I suppose. And it's rather kind of symmetrical, not really, not in absolute terms, but in terms of how it protects the hand, it feels way more symmetrical in its coverage than, say, French An 11 kind of saber or French 1882 style saber, which is really heavier on this side. This one is, in the sense it's not completely symmetrical, but when you're holding it, it feels way more protective. And maybe that's just because of the lack of open work, I suppose. So your hand feels really well nested in there. You'll see it has some nice gentle curves, and it has a slot underneath. Oh, it has a slot towards the bottom here for your porte-épée. There we go in focus. And the way it's fixed in place, there's a slot in the pommel section here. So it doesn't kind of just hook in as some other sabers do. This one has its position here where it gets slotted in and then fixed in place. So I wonder if in here, this has a hole. I wonder if it's like a full, if it goes all around here and then has a hole the tang goes through to keep it in place, or in what way it's fixed. No markings. We have a vestigial quillin. So this is more decorative, I suppose, than anything else. One really cool thing, though, is this upturned lip on the inside. So this is obviously, I think, makes it more comfortable to hold on your hip. It'll be less annoying than a semi-sharp edge as you have on the outside. And I wonder, though, if it also perhaps had the function of catching a blade. If, you know, something comes towards you this way, this may kind of stop it or deviate it somewhere else. Now, moving on to the blade, and I think this is where this sword gets really interesting. It has, look at this really interesting double fuller setup it has. So it has two equal fullers at the top of the spine and down towards the edge. And in the middle, this kind of, the blade is just flat and very thick. And in terms of thickness, you can kind of understand that this blade was designed for use, and I think for thrusting kind of use, because look how thick it is at the bottom side. So this is the edge side, and basically for the first third, it's as thick as the spine. This is just like a slab of steel that has no bend in it whatsoever. This is a solid steel. And then we see the bottom fuller tapers off around the point where the spine, where the edge starts thinning out. It tapers off and disappears. And here we start. It still stays thick though. And it only becomes like an actual sharpenable edge. Maybe in the last fifth, I would say here is where the blade is actually thin enough that it could be sharpened. It's not on this one. But already here, let's say, it's a little too thick to be sharpened. So my assumption here is a very thrust-heavy or centric blade. Interestingly enough, I don't know if these fullers acted as markings or something, because the top fuller ends basically where the edge sharpenable area kind of starts beginning. So who knows? Anyway, we have, as I mentioned, this flat section. There's no ridge or anything, it's completely flat. But then as we move to the end of the fuller here, it develops a bit of a lozenge section to the blade. So you see the central ridge, so kind of a diamond section more or less. So you see the central ridge that then runs up to the tip. A very interesting and, while not fancy, it's a rather complex blade configuration. It's very interesting how it moves from flat to lozenge sectioned here, how the fullers are positioned, how they differentially taper off. So one goes out really soon, one doesn't. How thick the blade is at the forte. Just a very interesting blade shape. It also has a slight curve. It's almost undetectable, I would say, but it is technically curved. So, I mean, I guess it is a saber by all definitions. And it has a spear tip here, you'll see. Not very pointy, but it's not broken. So this is its actual tip. It's very thin here too. So this is the sharpened or sharpenable part. So the whole sword, holding it, feels kind of like what a cuirassier sword may feel like. So something that's heavy, big, it's not meant for fencing in a fancy way. It's meant like for, I suppose, a cavalry charge, and just to, you know, thrust through perhaps heavily padded or rather padded kind of defenses without breaking or bending. So this is the feeling I get from this sword. I may be wrong. I don't have direct resources about it, but yeah, this is the Portuguese 1915. I hope you like it. It's a really very beautiful sword to hold, and I hope you enjoy it. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.